London, England, the month of May 1536. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of the bloodthirsty King Henry VIII, has been accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations are no doubt made up so Henry could be done with her and remarry, but justice in those days was in short supply. In prison, Anne is at times hysterical but sometimes calm, waiting for the word. Will she lose her head or be burned at the stake? Her friend and ally Archbishop Thomas Cranmer informs her that it'll be the former, the lesser of two evils. May 19th, 8 a.m., dressed in a dark gray robe of damask and covered in a mantle of white ermine fur, she's led to the scaffold. I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me, she says at the end of a moving speech. She's blindfolded. She waits, kneeling, facing the floor. Her head is severed from her body by a swift blow of a Frenchman's sword. Did she die in an instant, or for a few seconds did she remain conscious? Did she make a face and try to speak after her head was no longer attached to her body? That's what some witnesses said. Could it be possible? Today we're going to talk about all kinds of forms of decapitation, but we'll start with the express version, such as the way that the 36-year-old Anne Boleyn went. Okay, so we need to tell you about Mike, aka Miracle Mike. He lost his head in the USA in 1945 and he lived on for another 18 months. Mike was a chicken whose brainstem remained intact and whose blood clotted after his beheading. He survived due to the position of the brain in a chicken's head and the fact that his executor sliced his head at a certain angle. Because of the remaining brain, he could control his movements and his breathing and heartbeat were regulated. This could never, ever happen to a human. But we thought we'd tell you about the animal on record that has survived the longest after being decapitated. In view of today's show, we might ask how long a human is conscious after the act. Has a head ever fallen into a basket or landed on a scaffold and looked up at the blue sky and thought, damn, I won't see that again? It's hard to say, of course, because it's not as if scientists are presently doing decapitation tests on humans. They have, however, tested on live rats. They've cut off rodents' heads and then measured the electrical activity in their brain. It turns out the rats might think for a few seconds while their head is not connected to the body. In one study, the brain signals were lost after 17 seconds, although the researchers said consciousness was gone at around the 4-second mark. They also noticed something else. That was one last surge of activity after about a minute. They called this the wave of death. It's generally thought that the brain activity also may last 3 to 4 seconds after a human is decapitated, but there have been instances where people have reported that the headless person seemed alive for longer. Take the case of a Frenchman who was a convicted murderer and guillotined in 1905. This is what the doctor wrote. I was able to note immediately after the decapitation, the eyelids and lips of the guillotined man worked in irregularly rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds. I waited for several seconds. The spasmodic movement ceased. The face relaxed, the lids half closed on the eyeballs. The doctor, shocked, shouted the man's name, Longhi, only to see his eyelids open once again and look right at him for a few seconds. The question is, was that the wave of death? There are other reports of so-called lucid decapitation. One involved a car crash in the US that happened in 1989. An Army veteran saw his friend die, and not only that, his buddy had been decapitated. He later remarked, my friend's head came to rest face up and from my angle upside down. As I watched, his mouth opened and closed no less than 2 times. The facial expressions he displayed were first of shock or confusion, followed by terror or grief. If this is true, if humans can think after they lose their head, then being decapitated has to be one of the weirdest ways to die. Being beheaded by an executioner at the top of his game, someone with the right tools, may not actually be the worst way to die, but the fact is beheading can be a very messy business. We might take, for instance, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots on February 7, 1587. She was taken to the scaffold, and while knelt down, the executioner asked for her forgiveness for what he was about to do. She said to him, I forgive you with all my heart for now. I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles. He did, but his form was off that day. After she uttered her final words, Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit, he struck with his axe. He missed his mark, her slender neck, and instead hit her in the head. She was certainly not dead since she moaned in pain. The second blow was on target and killed her, except bits of stubborn sinew hung on and he had to cut through that. Finally, he grabbed her head, held it aloft, and shouted to the crowd, God save the Queen. To make the spectacle even worse, the beautiful auburn hair he was holding turned out to be a wig, and Mary's head fell with an unceremonious plop to the floor. Her head, adorned with only short gray hair, rolled onto the ground in front of the shocked witnesses. One of them swore he saw her lips move. We don't know exactly how long she lasted after that first wayward blow, but you can understand that being beheaded by a bad executioner was a pretty unpleasant experience. It gets worse, a lot worse. It would be an understatement to say that the beheading of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was a bit of a botched job. Margaret was accused of being a traitor and was locked up in the Tower of London by the prolific lady killer Henry VIII. She denied she'd done anything wrong and even scribbled a poem on her cell wall. It started, "For traitors on the block should die, I am no traitor, no, not I." The poem fell on deaf ears and off to the chopping block she went. He hacked and hacked at her neck, missing most times, sometimes hitting her in the back, sometimes hitting her head. It said it took 11 blows to finish her off. One witness later said that the person with the axe was a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. Maybe it was hard to get the staff in those days. Maybe he was an intern, or maybe Margaret just made his job difficult. Another account says that she refused to lay her head in the block and that she moved around during the blows while telling the executioner to do his best in the circumstances. It states, "She ran about the scaffold and the executioner followed her with his axe, aiming many fruitless blows at her neck before he was able to give the fatal stroke." In any case, it was a brutal death. Beheading shouldn't have lasted too long if the executioner's tool was sharp and he had good aim. The tools back then were usually a heavy sword, but bearded axes were also sometimes the weapon of choice. As you've now heard, not all beheadings went as planned. This is why new technologies were created. We tend to think that the French invented the guillotine in the 18th century, but very similar devices were around for a long time before that. The Halifax gibbet, named after a town in northern England, was used the last time in 1650. On that occasion, one man had stolen some cloth and another man had stolen 2 horses. Harsh, but such were the times. The Halifax gibbet worked in a way similar to the guillotine, in that a heavy axe was fastened to a wooden block and raised into the air by rope. When the rope was cut, the block and the blade would fall down and decapitate the prisoner. The block was so heavy that one witness once wrote that it could have decapitated a bull. It was certainly better than the axe, and a lot better than a knife, but we'll get to that later. First, let's talk about someone named Joseph Ignace Guillotin. He didn't invent the guillotine and was even against the death sentence. What he did do was call for a more humane form of executing a person than chopping off their head with a sword or an axe or breaking them on the wheel. He wanted executions to be painless, once remarking about a machine that would cut off your head in the twinkling of an eye and you never feel it. Indeed, the machine invented that would get a lot of use in France had a blade and connecting weight that weighed around 176 pounds. This fell from a height of 14 feet, and the person it fell on had his head secured by a round frame called the lunette. It was so good at what it did that it was hailed as the execution that never fails. Only a century or so earlier, executions were supposed to be a long, drawn-out spectacle that crowds could enjoy. People were slowly broken on wheels, or they were pulled limb from limb by horses, and they were supposed to suffer unimaginable pain. The guillotine, or the national razor as it would be called during the French Revolution, was reliable, fast, and more humane. Believe it or not, in the 21st century there have been people that have called for the introduction of the guillotine in the US. Jay Chapman, who created the 3-drug protocol in 1977 that's now used for lethal injection, said in 2007 that the guillotine was the simplest form of execution. He said, "I'm not at all opposed to bringing it back. The person's head is cut off and that's the end of it." Before that, in 1996, a Georgia state legislator named Doug Tepe tried to bring the guillotine back, but to no avail. So if you're ever in the unenviable position of having to choose between methods of decapitation, it seems the guillotine would be the way to go. There's not much chance of that though, since it was last used in France in 1977 and has never been used again anywhere else. This now brings us to the very worst form of decapitation, that of being decapitated by a knife. This much slower and way more painful process happened in Spain centuries ago, and it was thought to be a more noble way to die than having your throat slit. Today, such a gruesome act would not be carried out legally as a form of capital punishment, although people can still be decapitated by sword under the law in the country of Saudi Arabia. If it happens these days, and it has, the criminals doing the act are usually insurgents in the Middle East and Asia, members of organized crime, or certifiably insane people that have lost their minds and attacked innocent folks. A few years back, it happened to a woman in Mexico with her executioner announcing, "Well, gentlemen, this is what happens to all those in the Gulf Cartel. On behalf of Los Zetas." The fighting over the drug turf in Mexico has actually resulted in quite a lot of people losing their heads, sometimes when they were alive and sometimes after they were killed another way. The scary truth is, since the message can be spread using social media, these groups at times have used decapitation to induce fear in their opponents or the public. It can also create terror for governments and citizens of the world, if we're talking about insurgent groups. In such grisly murders, the decapitation is not over when a heavy blade falls, but it's slow and painful. Soft tissues are first cut, then ligaments and bones that hold the neck together have to be cut with much more effort. When it happens this way, we can certainly say it is one of the worst ways to die. Now you need to watch this: strangest ways people died. Or have a look at this: what happens when you die?